And I'm saying we have to get away from, all these explanations around, and we can talk about James Lindsay and Chris Rufo, but also Yascha Mounk, the liberals as well, Yascha Mounk, Francis Fukuyama, and others. They all are kind of buying into this argument that this is some kind of perversion of Marxism, maybe via postmodernism, that's led us to go into a wrong turn quite recently, whereas everything was fine in the 2000s, but suddenly we've gone on this wrong turn. And my argument is no, actually what we're living through is a continuation and an acceleration of pre-existing trends, not a deviation from pre-existing trends.
Yeah, you've occupied a very interesting space in this debate where I was going to come on to the sort of anti-woke liberals, because famously, myself and Carl have had a bit of a spat with the likes of James, who has insisted with, I think, increasingly esoteric interpretations that this postmodern neo-Marxism is actually a form of ancient Gnosticism that's being reinterpreted through minority concerns, and don't look at how liberalism might have been culpable. Everything was fine in the 1990s. We can just go back to it and it won't lead to the same place. And from your book, which I found quite interesting, was that you not only just said, look, the critical theorists, the Frankfurt School, yes, they did have a Marxist bent, but they themselves were existing antagonistic to their own revolutionized students on Berkeley campuses and the like. But also, it's unlikely that the kids that are going through the academy are coming into academia with absolutely no preformed socially liberal conclusions, are being brainwashed by the academy, because lots of them don't even read these complex texts anyway, and then are coming out as true revolutionaries. There was something that happened culturally before they entered academia, and it's not just purely a product of imbibing ideas that are being fed to them. It's more so like politics by vibe. It's politics by feeling of an affinity of group membership, or feeling like you're the right person in this particular issue.
Yeah, this is really an empathizing rather than systematizing. So there's a writer, Sacha Baron Cohen, I think is his name, who no relation to the guy who did Borat. But I don't know. But Baron Cohen, maybe it was Simon Baron Cohen. But the argument there is, the argument there is that you have this more male brain kind of systematizing type system of ideas, and this more female brain empathizing. So we're definitely, and if you think about religion, Calvinism, very textual, doctrinal, splitting hairs on doctrine, that's the more male brain systematizing. This Pentecostalism is more feeling the Holy Spirit. That is more that kind of emotional empathizing. And actually, that is the kind of idea that woke is. It is all about feeling sorry for the plight of very particular groups, very particular victim groups. And that will be, Black Americans, Indigenous, gay, and now trans, and women, for example, in radical feminism. And that is really the core of it, is this empathy. And then on the flip side of that empathy is, of course, hostility towards whoever is causing them pain, which would be whites, for example, would be men. So you're anti-whiteness, anti-masculinity. Now, what is the difference between that left liberal who is simply feels guilty about past misdeeds, feels empathetic towards minority groups, and has bought into what I call the fascist scare argument that majorities are to be feared, distrusted, and disliked, right? So you have these three elements. Minorities good, majority bad, at its simplest level, plus, minus. That is enough. That is enough to ground a simple rule, which will then guide you to herd in behind anybody who's expressing those values. So what I argue is actually, I use the example which is used in complexity theory of the flock of birds, where no one bird in the flock knows what the master plan is, where they're heading to, what shape the flock should take. But they have a set of simple rules: stay a certain distance away from the 7 birds around you, avoid predators, get out of the way. And out of that arises this emergent phenomenon of flocking behavior. Very similar thing, I think, is going on with woke, is you have, what is the simple rule? Majority bad and to be feared, minority is good, and you should be empathetic towards these totemic minorities, race, gender, sexual minorities. Anybody who is doing anything to, essentially advance, who's doing anything in the name of those minorities, you herd in behind, you flock in behind. Anyone who is running down the majority groups, again, you flock in behind. And that's it. You don't actually have to know about postmodernism and Marcuse and Marxism and overthrowing the existing system. None of that stuff really matters. So I'm saying that the bulk of this phenomenon is that chunk of sort of left liberal, bleeding heart liberals. Now, it is true, Chris Ruvo's right, that it is true that Marxism, there was a crisis of ideas within the radical revolutionary left, and they did lose faith in the working class, and they did move to identity groups, and all this stuff about Paulo Freire being all of that is true. And so you can certainly see continuities between Black Pantherism and BLM, between, the Weather Underground and Antifa. And so I'm not denying that at the rhetorical level and at the level of talking about, the system is rigged, it's racist, there's a hierarchy that's structural, and all these buzzwords around critical race and gender theory. That's all true. But to my mind, that doesn't explain a whole set of other things. So for example, affirmative action came in the 70s. This is well before the development of these ideas around critical race and gender theory.
It predates intersectionality by at least 20 years.
Yeah. And similarly, racial sensitivity training is already there in the 70s. And speech codes and disparate impact, hostile environment, all of these conceptions are well in train already. 70s, 80s, speech codes are flourishing. And this is not, when people talk about minority self-esteem, that's got nothing to do with Marxism at all. So all this idea about hypersensitivity is simply coming out of this humanitarian left liberal tradition. And I think that is much more central to what we're talking about. Now, Richard Hanania and Chris Caldwell do get at this a bit in their books. But I think that's the core, and that provides you with a foundation. Now, it is then true that the radicals are doing their thing, and they're actually meeting the evolutionary left liberals. The bleeding heart evolutionary left liberals are essentially meeting the radicals and commingling with them, because there's not really that much difference, other than that the radicals have systematized this into theories about systems, patriarchy, white supremacy, those sorts of critical paradigms. They've intellectualized them, and they're talking about revolution. But that doesn't mean that they're the main engine behind this. The main engine is the sort of, if you take university faculties, 50 to 60% of the faculty are soft left. They're not hardcore Marxists. And that soft left is why you get cancel culture succeeding. It's why you get diversity statements, because they support these out of this guilt stroke empathy complex.
Yeah, one great example of this, I've always been a comic book nerd, is that in the 50s, they introduced the Comics Code Authority, which essentially censored comic books with depictions of divorce or drug addiction or brutality and violence or even ghost schools and werewolves. And the guy behind this was a psychologist named Frederick Wortham, and he was just profiling a bunch of juvenile delinquents and who were blaming it on what they'd seen in comics, and the science was essentially bunk. This guy later went on to contribute evidence for Brown v. Board of Education. So the idea that he was a subversive Marxist revolutionary, there's no real evidence for that, but he clearly was a left liberal with concerns about using his expert status to tweak things in the favor of the care and harm moral foundations to protect kids from what he's, in a weirdly socially conservative way, thought were like untoward moral forces, to then go on and do proactive desegregation and essentially like early stage affirmative action policies with that. To then argue that was, retrospective Marxist intersectionality is a bit of a stretch, and I agree. So the question is then, why are default liberal young women the predominant driver of this if they haven't bought into all of this incredibly esoteric Marxist revolutionary rhetoric?
So basically at the core of what is this thing at the core, a lot of what we've seen, I would argue, since the late 60s is a scaling up. So you actually had a lot of these ideas, they were already there in Berkeley. In Canada, the Toronto District School Board. In Britain, it might have been the Greater London Council. You had these hotspots for radical activism where actually nothing much has changed. Really, those ideas have not really changed. However, if you were outside the hotspots, if you were in Texas or Minnesota, or if you were in, Northern England, you wouldn't have encountered this stuff. It was only happening in these small spots. Now, what's happened over time is we've had a scaling up. The expansion of the university system was number one. Then what happens most recently, if we take the period since 2015 or thereabouts, and David Rosado, who I have talked about before, who's done big data on this, what you can see is if you look at academic abstracts, so these are the abstracts for academic articles, people are talking about racism, sexism, and homophobia at a very high level already in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It's being talked about in those journals at an extremely high level. But in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian even, and the mainstream media, it's not being talked about very much until we get social media, which bridges these two worlds. All of a sudden, academics are rubbing shoulders with journalists, and meanwhile, the journalism model is being thrown upside down by the end of classified advertising. And so now it's about clicks. And once it's about clicks, it's about driving virality on social media. So social media really allows these ideas to escape the sort of campus Wuhan lab and spread into the media. And once they're in the media, they get into, and on social media, they get into youth culture, which they hadn't have been. I mean, what's astounding is you read about the second awakening, which was the rise of political correctness in the late 80s, early 90s when I was a student. And actually, the students weren't particularly woke in many ways. And you actually had real racist incidents happening on campus, not hoaxes. Now it's basically anytime there's a racist incident, that's probably a hoax. But in the 80s and 90s, these things were real. So the culture had not yet spread to young people in anything like the same way. I mean, it had a little bit, but nothing like it has now. And that's because of social media allowing this thing to escape. So a lot of what the book is talking about is it's a scaling up. It's a quantitative change, and it is not a qualitative shift of ideas, this third awakening. Now, also, because it's a quantitative change, it is much more in the politics and in the media. And so now it's actually more of a political and an electoral issue, and it really wasn't in that second wave. So yeah, that's kind of sort of how I'm thinking about the spread of this thing, comparing earlier waves to the current wave. It's a quantitative, not a qualitative shift.
So if we're describing this as a kind of mind virus, of course, people, if they weren't inoculated by sufficient cultural antibodies, that's how they got infected. So I've been very nice to you so far.
Okay,
Eric,
no, be mean.
No, I think we're gonna hash out some areas of disagreement over here. So it's not purely a product of ideas. People haven't just bought into the race Marxist drivel that they've been fed from universities. But if they think they're being good and woolly and liberal to extend compassion to these identity groups that they essentially treat like infants who are poor and oppressed, then is there not something within the ideology of liberalism, which a kind of logic which leads ineluctably to taking on these ideas to be authentically liberal? Do you see what I'm saying? So is there not something within the liberal anthropology which leads to this line of critique that has been engineered somewhat by subversive Marxists to parasitize the dominant culture in such a way that it has?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it sort of gets into a broader debate about how responsible is liberalism for all this. And I guess I distinguish between classical liberalism, classical liberal principles, liberalism as a system of ideas, and liberalism as an actual existing reality on the ground. Not in the 19th century, when actually liberalism was moving with nationalism and, in fact, informing nationalism. As we move into the 20th century, particularly after World War I, that begins to change, and we get the rise of, well, a little bit earlier than that, we get the rise of liberal progressivism, which was this idea of being left-wing, actually, particularly on economics, and being sort of culturally liberal and anti-traditional. And that comes together only in the early 20th century. In the 20th century, then, we get this species called modern liberalism. You can call it social democracy. You can call it left liberalism. That fusion of the left with liberalism. And that's really what liberalism is about. And it's about extending the benefits of rights to women and minorities. And so a lot of the myths and the emotional ballast behind liberalism in the 20th century is about the equality side of liberalism. It's about the struggle for black civil rights, for women getting the vote, and so on. And so a lot of the power now behind, if you identify as a liberal, a lot of your core myths are egalitarian myths, actually. And this is one of the reasons why I think liberalism goes off so heavily in an egalitarian direction. No, not on economics. So liberalism was always had a strong market-based, property rights-based dimension to it. On economics, moderate. And that's not where the problem lies. But what I argue in the book is left liberalism actually has no bounds to its left when it comes to cultural issues. So it's extreme on culture, moderate on economics. And so it's open-ended. So whereas Ibram X. Kendi might say we need an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that's strict proportionality of bodies by color in every elite position. That would be and this is because there's some sort of invisible structure. So that Marxist language about hierarchical structure. That's why we need to have this amendment. Okay, that would be the kind of cultural Marxist position. But if you take the left liberal position, the left liberal position comes to the same thing because they say, well, we need more diversity. We need more inclusion. We need more equity. We just want more. We want fewer dead white males. We want, this is the kind of narrative that you get out of the left liberals. They aren't sort of saying, well, Jesus was black and ancient Egypt was the origin of Western civil. But what they say is, we were really bad. Shame on us. We need to do better. Well, where's the boundary? Like how much better? Like how many? What's the share of engineers that should be women? More, How sensitive should we be to the concerns of indigenous and black people? More. So it's always more, which means that, like that flock of birds, it's always herding and moving and flocking in the ratcheting. So it's about ratcheting steadily, building on whatever advances were made in the past. You push them further, you push them further. It's not revolutionary, but it's evolutionary. It's like a boiling frog. So we get to the same place, and all of a sudden, these left liberals are agreeing with the cultural Marxists that, defund the police, right? Yeah, mandatory diversity statements. All of these things suddenly. Now, there are a few points where there may be some disagreement. Maybe the left liberal isn't as quick to say, cancel them. Cancel somebody. They said the British Empire did more good than harm. They got to be forced out of the university. But they're not that kind of a left liberal. There's a significant chunk of them who wouldn't be opposed to the person being canceled either. So they're not in the forefront, but they're also not opposed. They're ambivalent. They're torn, right? I mean, and you can see this in survey data in the book. So one question, here's a good question. Do you support mandatory diversity statements for hiring for academia? And what you'll find amongst academics is about a 2-to-1 support for these things. And it's worth noting, by the way, that Harvard has just removed mandatory diversity statements. And this is all under conservative pressure. It's not because their faculty wanted it. But that's an example of where the faculty is majority in support of this. A question like, do you support political correctness because it protects against discrimination, or do you oppose it because it stifles free speech? 3/4 of British academics, essentially, in the social sciences and humanities, 3 in 4 support political correctness. So this idea that it is a small number of people and everyone else is just scared to put their head above the parapet. No, that's wrong. On a survey, no one's watching you. And so, this is where left liberals are. They are the ones who've driven this phenomenon. And I liken it, yes, the cultural Marxists can weaponize that sensitivity, that fear of majorities. They can plug into that. And I use the metaphor of an electric guitarist. The guitar player is the cultural Marxist. The whole sound system and amplifier is the left liberals' majority in these institutions. And so the cultural Marxists can plug into the amplifier and suddenly their power is just magnified. So all it takes is a small number of them to move mountains. And this is what we see time and time again. And again, not because people are scared, and I've seen this dynamic. Cultural Marxists can make an argument about quotas on reading lists. And a lot of those left liberals are saying, yeah, well, actually, heart's in the right place. It strikes a chord. The cultural Marxist highest values are my highest values. It's equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for race, gender, and sexuality. Anti-racism is my highest values. So, of course, that sounds good. I'm going to go along with it. And that's why I place a lot more stress on this demand side, this receptivity to these radical ideas amongst that left liberal group.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m., only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.